Hello, everyone, and welcome to Debug Academy's DrupalCon presentation, I Choose You, Module Selection Without Tears or Fears. So today's agenda, I'm very excited. We're going to do a quick set of introductions of the presenters, and the bulk of the presentation, or I should say at least the first half, will be focused on just trying to assess module selection. So many times we're presented with numerous choices about solutions we might be able to implement on our website. What's the best way to kind of narrow those options and then implement them? So that's what we're going to be talking a lot about, is just assessing options and looking at contributed modules. Then we will quickly look at a code repository, and then the second half, in which my co-presenter, Omar Abid, will look at a case study about groups versus organic groups. And then if there's time, he'll talk about when to pursue contributed or custom solutions for when to kind of use a contributed module or when to write your own solution out, and when each choice makes sense. And then finally, how to test out these solutions quickly. There's at least one notable option out there that lets you spin up a Drupal site quickly online. So my name is Jack Garrett. I'm a web developer at Debug Academy. I have not been a web developer all my life. In fact, I've only been a developer for 2 years. Prior to my career switch, I was a historian. I got my doctorate in German African history, and I've taught at the university and high school level before making my career change. And probably a few months ago, I got my two Acquia certifications, the front-end specialist and the general developer kind of certificate, if you will, which I'm very excited about. So I will now turn this over for Omar to introduce himself.
Thank you, Jack. Hi, everybody. As Jack said, my name is Omar. I also work for Debug Academy for the last about year and a half. I actually began as a more traditional developer. I studied computer engineering at Virginia Tech and Marquette, where I learned more object-oriented programming, Java, Python, C++. And I went on to work at Parsons and GE and various other government contractors through internships before kind of finding my way to Debug Academy, where I learned to bridge the gap between the traditional object-oriented development I had learned in college and web development and larger enterprise web applications. So you'll see a lot of my contact info in the bottom and on the right here, and some of the projects I've worked on the right, including aamc.org, usda.org, and some of my background and education. I also recently, in the past month or two, became an Acquia certified developer. And yeah, in my free time, I enjoy writing. I'm a published author of children's books, currently working on a couple others, which are keeping me plenty busy. So thanks, it's nice to meet you all, and I'll join you back in the presentation a little bit later on after Jack concludes his portion. Thanks, Jack. Back to you.
So, Debug Academy, just quickly, is a locally owned and operated company in the greater DC area. We train companies and individuals both in person and online. So we'll train companies, kind of introducing them to Drupal, giving them a Drupal boot camp, if you will. But also we do the kind of custom trainings as well. And then individuals who are looking to make career changes like myself, who don't come from a programming background, we offer a 3-month part-time Drupal course that's available usually in person and remotely. The last semester pretty much ran all remote. but that will be happening in the fall. If you want to reach out to us, you can email our CEO, Ashraf Abid at Debug Academy, or tweet him at Ash Abid. All right, onward to the good stuff. How often have you felt, especially if you're just kind of new to Drupal, like, hey, I have this ticket, I need to choose the right module, but I see so many options, or it's just unclear. I'm just kind of getting washed over with so much information. I don't know how to parse through it all. How do I narrow the options down? And I think this picture on the right just spoke to me. It felt very Kafka-esque, where you might have some options, some viable options right away, and you're like, which one do I choose? Which exit do I leave? Or, ooh, hey, there's this other kind of shiny, maybe untested module that I might want to look at. And so what I'm hoping this presentation will get at is giving you the knowledge to choose which module is best for you depending on the context. So with the next set of slides, I'm going to talk about a situation. Let's say I'm given a ticket that says, I need to implement advanced forms on our website. It needs to have a lot of customization. There might be some other things coming down the pipe that this module might need to deal with, but it's kind of foggy and unclear. Please choose the module that will give us some advanced forms. Might be able to send an email and have options for like spam protection. So that's what I'm kind of given. Now I have to go out into the Drupal ecosphere and choose the right option. So how do I even start this search? First, you can go to drupal.org/project/project module. And you're given this wonderful little search box on the right, this little snapshot I did. And you're able to filter and kind of by a whole number of parameters. And I'll just kind of go over some of these fairly quickly. Most importantly, you want to think about, are you working on a Drupal 7 site or a Drupal 8 site? So you want to search by version of Drupal, and that kind of falls under works with field. What stability do you want the module to be in? Do you want it to just be a stable release, or is beta okay? Or alpha, is that all right? So alpha, it could change, the code might break if you install it, and it's still being worked on. I think the maintenance option I think is important. So is this module being actively maintained? Are there new features going to be added? Or is it minimally maintained, where the module is kind of roughly done and only bug fixes are going to be added to, kind of patched? Or is the module basically unsupported and it's kind of maybe not in the graveyard, but it's not being actively worked on by anyone? You can sort by most installed, relevancy, or last release. But for the most part, to be honest, when I kind of search, I just select the version of Drupal I'm working for, and then I just type in forms or whatever I'm looking for. Most installed for me generally works. The second option is use your favorite internet search engine and just type Drupal 8 forms module or whatever module you're working for, and just see if there's any interesting articles out there that might give you a lead on what to work with. Let's say, take the example of implementing advanced forms. I do the first option. I type in the search module's form field, forms, and I see a module in the results that says web form. That's a module that's out there. It's actually very popular. How do I decide whether I should use that in my project? Well, I click the link that says web form, and you're taken to the module page, and you're presented with a very long page with lots of information in text. And so, especially if you're new to Drupal, I think you'll be kind of overwhelmed by the various headings, statistics, descriptions, and links. So how do you navigate this to make the correct decision on choosing the right module? And so the next set of slides is parsing different sections of this page out and give you some guidance on how to understand the information provided to you on the module page. So once again, I'm going to be looking at the web form module page and seeing, like, is this a good fit for implementing advanced forms on my page? And taking it step by step. So the first step, this might seem a little silly, but actually, I think it's actually very helpful, is you read the module's description. So it says web form is the module for making forms and surveys, excellent. And then after submission, it can send out emails to administrators or people who submit form entries. And the results can be exported into Excel. I was like, oh, right, this already sounds great. I'm so excited. It just from those few sentences, I feel like that kind of ticket about sending emails from forms is going to be helpful. I know I need to also do kind of anti-spam solution. It didn't say anything about spam yet, so that might not be, I'm going to still have a question in the back of my head about whether this is the right module or not. But overall, okay, this sounds promising. I'm going to read on. A few other things you might notice is that this introduction documentation was updated in the May 31st of 2020. That's always a good sign that it's being actively maintained in some sense. I kind of speak about the description because sometimes when you look at a module, there might not be any description, or it might be very minimal, and it will be kind of unclear what the module does. So taking a moment and reading the description is helpful, even if that advice seems a bit basic. The next part is to look at the project information. So in this picture, we see that the web form module is being used by nearly 500,000 websites or Drupal sites, which is an incredible amount of websites being used. Sometimes, actually a lot of times, you'll see modules where there's just a few hundred being used, or maybe even under 100. And so if that was the case, if I saw, let's say this module had only a few hundred sites using this module, I might be concerned. I feel like I would have to read on. But seeing that really high number makes me feel pretty positive that this is going to be a well-maintained module. I'll say this: if a module only has a few hundred kind of sites using it, that's not a deal breaker. So don't be completely scared off by a low install base. There's other information that can help you make a decision about using a module, even if it has a small install base. There are more important factors here. If I click on this link that says 491,847, you're taken to a page that gives you a graphical representation and breakdown of how this module is being used for its different versions. So this pink center represents the web form module on 7.x-4.x. And so a lot of these sites are using Drupal 7. So if I look at the bottom, I see the two versions of web form that have about, about 360,000 installs. And then for the Drupal 8 versions of web form, I see about 120,000, which is once again a very high install base. I mention this because there are plenty of modules that will have a high installation base, but they will be pretty much only for a Drupal 7 or a Drupal 7 version of the module. And if you're on a Drupal 8 site, the install base might be quite low. So digging into this number is important to getting a better picture of how it's being used across kind of the Drupal ecosphere. So once again, this confirms for this web form example, yeah, this site's being used, don't have too many worries about it. The next section on the module page to look at is the downloads. What versions of the module are available? So we have an alpha version that's actually just released, June 20th, 2020, and it requires Drupal 8.8 or Drupal 9. I need this, like for my example, I need this to be on production. It's a Drupal 8 site. I might not want to include an alpha version because the code could change. And in fact, you see that there are some testing results that give me pause about its release candidate. It said composer require failure. So I might not want to include an alpha version of a module on my site. So the next candidate is this one that's all in green. It's very inviting. And it says, this is a Drupal 8 5.16 version of the module. And this was released fairly recently too. June 3rd, 2020. It's stable. The green shield represents it's part of the Drupal security kind of policy. And it's passed its results or passed the testing results. And that kind of ticks off all of the things that says that this is, hey, this version of the module isn't going to change. It was just recently released. So I feel comfortable using that, especially coupled with, some of the other pieces of the module I looked at. Once again, this is all pointing towards, hey, this sounds like a good use case. And then if I had a Drupal 7 site, I would use this version. Now, getting a little bit more into, I think, some advanced decision-making, if you will, about modules is looking at the page that's the issue queue. And if you're still not sold on the module, the issue queue is where you're going to get in the weeds a little bit, but it's going to give you a lot of information about implementation details, what issues people have had using the module, which will help you make the best informed decision. So I'm looking at this bug report of the web form module, and I see 210 open bugs, which initially might give me pause because that seems like a lot of bugs. However, coupled with what we've been looking at, that this is a considerably used module so the number was like 500, nearly 500,000 websites. 210 bugs doesn't seem that high to me anymore, especially when the second part of this bug report says that there's been about 4,500, 4,600 total bugs, and most of them have been resolved. The second thing to look at is the response rate. The response rate for every new issue that's raised, 90% of the time, there is a response to this issue, that someone is looking at it and engaging in a conversation. So to me, that says this is not only being maintained, but there is kind of active a community around this module. So if there is going to be a new bug, it will most likely be attended to by the Drupal maintainers, the Drupal community, which is great. If that response rate is lower, once again, take a pause here and think about if I implement this module and no one's responding to the bugs, well, then I will have to create patches or write code, which is something to keep in mind, or someone on the team will have to patch the module. All right. The next part is the documentation. This is important. Sometimes when you choose a module, how to implement, to install, and use the module might not be clear. If there is good documentation, that is really helpful. And unfortunately, not all modules have good documentation. Webform is a good example of an extraordinary, well-produced and well-curated module with documentation that's thorough and in detail. You probably won't find this. However, the more documentation, the better. So what happens in a situation where you don't have considerable documentation on a module? Well, I would say leverage the issue queue. The issue queue is going to be where you're going to find out the roadblocks, the hardships that people have with using a module. So in this example, want to use the web form module, I want to implement an email option. Have people had issues doing emails, or let's say the documentation wasn't clear about how to use email in web form? Well, I would search for in the issue queue for email and see what people are saying and read through the responses. And the responses to the issues will kind of be a pseudo documentation, which really provides, I think, an understanding of what roadblocks or how you might use a module in reality. Now, a second example, which I haven't, in this use case, is I want to implement, anti-spam solution, and I've heard a lot about this module called Antibot. So I'm going to see, has anyone tried to use this module called Antibot in web form? So in the issues queue, I'm going to type Antibot, and this is what comes up. And all the responses and issues are going to help give me a really solid picture of how to achieve a solution, which I think is fantastic. So the issue queue is a kind of living and dynamic documentation in some ways. The final kind of bit here is, if you're more advanced, you can browse the code repository. That is kind of the skeleton, the nuts and bolts of the module. And you can click on the link that says browse code repository, and it's going to take you to, well, the code repository. And what's really helpful, even if you don't know like how to code PHP or look at module files or YAML files, yada, yada, yada. A lot of times there are READMEs in here that can give you a little bit more information about how to use a module. So it's definitely always worth a look to look at the code repository, to look at the README file. Finally, test and prototype. Let's say I found the web form module and another module that seemed to be good answers for my ticket, my use case. Well, then I kind of have to test and prototype them out to see, will it work? Sometimes you just have to build it a little bit to see what happens. That way you can notice the roadblocks you might hit as you're using it, and then try a second option if you feel like the first one isn't working really well. So the last bullet point I think is helpful. Determine the path of least resistance, and then you continue. Omar will talk a little bit more about this approach using a case study. And I'm going to pass it over to him now. And thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you, Jack. And hi, everybody. This is Omar again. So I'm going to be going through a case study where we put to use some of the concepts that Jack talked about in choosing between two modules that seem very similar on the surface. And I wanted to do this example with a use case of groups in mind. A lot of us are familiar with groups, especially considering things like Facebook, where certain content is shared between groups. People have different roles within a group. People can be added and removed. So we're going to go through an example of two very similar modules and talk about why you might choose one over the other. So the two modules here in question are one called group, which the module name is called group, and the other is organic groups, and the module name is OG. So if you search drupal.org/project/group and drupal.org/project/OG, you'll find these two modules. And our use case is going to consider these modules on the basis of the following example. We want to be able to add users to groups to share specific content with specific subsets of people. You can consider it like a classroom or just a community of people that want to share resources, but that the general public should not have access to those resources. People may belong to multiple groups. There might be even subgroups, and just different orderings of people. And within those groups, people may have different roles. If you consider it in a classroom, you might have a teacher and students, maybe, administrator, or basically anything. Whatever the use case is, you might have even not just roles within the group, but roles before you get into the group, such as a pending user. Do they have to be approved to join the group? Or blocked users even. Can somebody be forbidden from joining a group? And you can consider this in the case of Facebook with like friends or people who are blocked from certain groups. So a lot of use cases that can happen with groups, and we can kind of get into the nitty-gritty here a bit. So let's take a look at the project pages for these two groups and just take a quick snapshot of the immediate information we're presented with. We see organic groups on the left and group on the right. Organic groups has a little bit more than double the amount of installations. They have an alpha release and a stable, an alpha release, for Drupal 8 and a stable release for Drupal 7. And on the flip side, groups has less installations, a release candidate for Drupal 8, and a beta release for Drupal 7, which is from 2015, so a while back at this point. If we look into kind of what to take away from this information, we see that both are pretty widely used. A few thousand installations is a good number for this kind of functionality. We do see that perhaps we can get the sense that organic groups is more widely used for Drupal 7 because they have a stable release, and this immediate snapshot of the number of installations doesn't tell us if those are installations for Drupal 7 or Drupal 8. We can get that information by digging a little deeper. But from this information, I get the sense that Drupal 7, that organic groups may have been more widely used for Drupal 7 because of the stable release and because of the more recent maintenance of that release. You see, from 2018 is when that release was released, and there was ongoing development even through 2019. Whereas on the group side, we see that the beta release for the Drupal 7 version was back in 2015, and development has only been done on the dev branch into 2017. So the Drupal 7 version of the group module is a bit out of date at this point compared to organic groups. On the flip side, we do see that both have recent versions in 2020 and 2019 for the Drupal 8 version. Ongoing development on the Drupal 8 version through April 2020 and June 2020 of groups. So those look to be about on equal footing. The Drupal 8 version of organic groups is only an alpha release, whereas there's a release candidate for the groups version of Drupal 8. So that makes me think perhaps it's the Drupal 8 version of groups is kind of further along in terms of its readiness for Drupal 8. So read the docs. Once you get a quick snapshot of the module information, the project page has a lot of valuable information in its quick snapshot and description. However, a lot of Drupal modules also have links to external documentation, which is very valuable in terms of understanding the implementation and usage of various modules. Rather than read through that information here in this presentation, I already went through, I linked those external documentation pages for these two groups, for these two group modules, and I pulled out some of the main takeaway points from each. So we'll start with organic groups. Organic groups functions in a way that adds a field to all content entities. It basically adds a field saying which group should this content belong to, if any. And that might not be what you want, on first investigation of our use case, but it might be, and it kind of just depends on your use case. So every piece of content is basically able to be added to a group, and individual content itself can sort of be treated as a group with organic groups. Organic groups also supports various group roles, so admin, member, things like that. And they also support different ways to be added to groups, including requiring approval or invitation. So that was a quick snapshot of organic groups. And groups, on the other hand, treats groups as fieldable, extensible, and exportable entities. So rather than being a field on existing content, the group module treats groups like their own entity, which lends themselves to implementation of various hooks, and basically allows you to interface with it in a more traditional, I guess, Drupal 8 entity way. The group module also supports subgroups and different roles and permissions within groups, so in that way it acts very similarly to organic groups. So as kind of the quick takeaways there, organic groups, as you're reading the documentation, it leans heavily on Drupal 6 and Drupal 7 explanations, and whereas groups, a lot of the documentation got fleshed out with the Drupal 8 version of the module. So we get that sense of maybe organic groups was, leaned heavily toward Drupal 7, while groups is maybe more commonly used in Drupal 8. We also see, again, as a kind of a quick summary, that content is treated as groups in organic groups, with field overhead being added to all entities, to all content entities. And so, that gives one perspective of how this module might be used, whereas the group module treats groups as entities, and has kind of less overhead on non-group specific content. So those are just some items to keep in mind. In the end, it gets hard to make a declaration that one is better than the other because they both support different use cases, and it kind of just depends on which site, what functionality you're looking for. I also wanted to speak briefly on when you should even consider a Contrib module versus going to the custom code route. I know I've worked on a lot of projects where people say, okay, well, we can build whatever we want, let's just build it. And there should be an understanding of what are the costs of building your own custom modules versus accepting the flaws of some existing Contrib modules. So in general, there's a workflow here that's provided from the Drupal.org site, which explains the thinking behind how to get to a place of deciding to write custom code. Initially, if there is a solution that can be reached with the existing modules on a site, that should be the first priority. Our focuses here are that we want to reduce custom code because that reduces long-term maintenance of a site. As security patches come out and as developments are made and upgrades are made, maintaining custom code becomes a long-term overhead task that we accept when we write custom code. We also, on the flip side, want to limit unnecessary overhead from installing contributed modules. Some of these modules accomplish so many tasks, and we might not want to install a huge module just for a small subset of that functionality if it's going to bog down our site. So with that thinking, it really boils down to two very basic concepts. We want to exhaust all Contrib options before deciding to write our own custom code. When we consider all of the Contrib options, we spend our time doing our research on Google and doing our research on Drupal.org. We we come to an understanding that there are options out there. Even if there are bugs, we can decide whether or not we're willing to accept those bugs. And in general, it gets easier to resolve bugs, especially with a community of open source developers behind it, rather than develop a new solution from scratch. And those existing modules have focus from so many people who are already focused on fixing those bugs, and you can, rather than spending your time developing a custom solution, your time might be better spent contributing to resolving those bugs and getting the module to a place where you're comfortable using it, benefiting not only yourself and your project but other projects. At the same time, if you do get to a point where you need to develop a custom solution, which should sort of be a last resort or a very site-specific functionality, consider how that functionality might be used in more general use cases, and consider modularizing that code so that you can contribute pieces of it back to the Drupal.org community as a Contrib solution. I also wanted to speak briefly on testing modules. You can read documentation as long as you want, but at a certain point, it gets easier to flesh out whether or not a module will work for you by just testing it and installing it quickly and trying to see how it works and playing around with it. For that reason, I personally like to keep a vanilla or just a clean base Drupal installation on my computer, basically alongside my development environment, because using Composer or however you're maintaining and installing your modules, you're able to throw a module on top of your clean installation, test it out very quickly to see if it works as you expect, and without any interference from maybe custom code on your site or other modules or anything like that. So I do prefer to do that. I think it saves a lot of time, and if the module works as you expect, you don't run the risk of trial and error on your development site, and it's just a clean, quick test environment. That being said, so that's one way to test locally. If you are looking for another alternative, there's also simplytest.me for testing modules and patches and spinning up quick Drupal environments. So these environments are temporary. They're deleted, I believe, after 12 hours. And you can, this took me a little bit to figure out, but you can get admin access very quickly to those environments by using username admin, password admin. So obviously they're not very secure sites. They're public, they're global, but you can use them to quickly test, to simply test modules and patches. So on the bottom left here, we have an example of a Drupal issue and some of the patches submitted against that issue. If you click the simplytest.me button that's generated alongside those patches, you'll actually be taken to a spun up site that includes that patch. So you'll be able to test it live and see if that patch resolves the issue that this was opened against. So it's a very nice system for quickly spinning up sites. If you wanted to test a module for your use case outside of a specific issue, you could just visit simplytest.me, and it asks for the module name and the version you want to test against. So here we are using the group example again, and if I wanted to quickly see how those modules affect content on those sites, I could go create test content on those sites once I select my module and version, launch a sandbox version of that site, and test it out. And you see here in the top right the kind of I just wanted to point out the URL that it's generating for those sites that are spun up in a sandbox. It's just a hash, very quick throwaway Drupal site. So that might be a really good way. And I know I always see this button on Drupal issues, but I never really considered it unless I'm making heavy use of a module. But as part of this presentation, I explored Simply Test Me a little bit, and it was a very, very helpful site. So I do recommend that we make more use of that in the Drupal community. And that's really all there is about modules and module selection. We do thank you guys for listening to this presentation. I know it's hard to get through a lot of online presentations back to back, but we do appreciate you sitting through. Debug Academy is an organization that prides itself in educating others, taking people from any background really, and being able to build them into developers, and being able to build them into having a technical background. We are fleshing out courses for project managers or technical admins and site builders, and really there's a wide variety of courses. So if you're interested in diving into any specific Drupal or non-Drupal course or technical area in further detail, feel free to check us out on debugacademy.com or reach out with any topics you're interested in learning, and we'll try to create a course around that. Again, thank you very much, and we hope you enjoy the rest of DrupalCon. Thanks. Bye-bye.